What are you willing to do to preserve your own life? Are you ready to endure 30-degree frost, an icy wind that cuts to the bone? To live for weeks without any food, drinking melted snow instead of water? To be without clean clothes, without internet, without any comforts of civilization, and at the same time understand that the chances of someone saving you are zero? Were you ready to abandon all your ethical and moral principles to do horrific things that would help you survive for at least one day? These were the questions faced by the passengers of Flight 571, which crashed 50 years ago high in the Andes. Well, the whole world considered this event a terrible tragedy that claimed the lives of all passengers. However, it later turned out that most of them had survived.
Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Michael Stack and you're on the channel based on real events.
This incredible story of survival truly became iconic. Dozens of books were written about it and several films were made. One of them, Society of the Snows, was released just recently. To be honest, I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, which is probably for the best. I've only seen the 1993 film Alive. For starters, a little bit of backstory. The miracle of the Andes began with the Uruguayan amateur rugby team Old Christians and a match against the English team Old Boys, which they were to play in Santiago, Chile. To reach their destination and cross the Andes Mountains, club president Daniel Juan chartered the Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild 270 aircraft for the team. This immediately raises a logical question. Why an Air Force plane and not a regular passenger one? The answer is very simple. Money. This was a very cheap option for the flight, much cheaper than others. At that time, the Uruguayan military didn't have much funding, so they moonlighted by renting out their planes for passenger transport. And here's another incredibly interesting fact about this plane, on which the rugby team planned to fly over the world's longest mountain range. 78 such planes were produced in total, and 23 of them crashed. That's almost a third of the total number, so the chances of surviving a flight in such a rickety plane were about 66%. What's more, 9 of these accidents occurred before the Andean tragedy, and each one killed an average of 30 passengers. Only in rare cases did anyone survive after a crash of this plane. Nevertheless, 40 passengers and 5 crew members, including 2 pilots, boarded the liner. The first pilot, the commander Colonel Julio Cesar Ferrades, was a very experienced Air Force pilot with more than 5,000 hours of flight time. He was accompanied by the second pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguara, who, I'll tell you right now, made the flight quite unpleasant for everyone. In addition to the team's seats, there were 10 extra tickets, so players invited friends or family members to accompany them. Interestingly, one of the passengers cancelled their booking at the last minute and didn't fly on this plane, saving themselves from such a terrible fate. This seat was taken by Graciela Mariani, who was traveling to her eldest daughter's wedding, and this flight proved fatal for her. Due to a storm front over the mountain range, the crew made an emergency landing in Mendoza, Argentina. Since the cyclone did not weaken, they spent the night there. Departure was only permitted the following day. They were practically flying around because weather conditions, as before, remained unfavorable. On this map you can see the aircraft's flight path and the crash site. They could have chosen not to take such a circuitous route and flown directly, but the altitude of the mountains along the path was very close to this aircraft's service ceiling. If the plane was fully loaded, this direct route would have demanded extremely careful flying from the pilot to avoid the mountains. Therefore, taking into account the prevailing weather conditions, it was decided to fly the longer indirect route. Interestingly, Deeb, I previously mentioned that the second pilot organized such a fun flight for everyone. But the first one also made his contribution. The aircraft commander, Ferrades, had previously flown over the Andes 29 times. But on this flight, he entrusted the controls to the second pilot to give him some training. However, the second pilot had practically no flight hours on passenger transport flights. He had only flown attack aircraft before. When they were flying over the Andes, the clouds covered the mountains below, so the pilots were unable to visually confirm their location. Shortly after crossing the Planchon Pass, the co-pilot informed controllers that he expected to reach Curico in 1 minute, which should have already alerted air traffic controllers, as the flight time from Planchon Pass to Curico was usually 11 minutes, and 3 minutes later, the co-pilot reported they were flying over Curico and requested permission to descend. Subsequent reports asserted that the co-pilot had incorrectly assessed his position, having failed to consider the powerful headwind that was substantially slowing the aircraft. Consequently, the aircraft encountered a cyclone, forcing the pilot to navigate the plane almost entirely by instruments, effectively blind. Also, for unknown reasons, he could not see the aircraft's navigation radio, which displayed the distance to the Curico radio beacon, with almost 70 kilometers still remaining to fly. The air traffic controller cleared the aircraft for descent, unaware that it was still flying high above the Andes. First Officer Ferrades also failed to detect the critical navigational error. During its descent, the aircraft then encountered severe turbulence. Nando Parado, one of the survivors, recounted how the aircraft rapidly descended several hundred feet above the clouds. Initially, the rugby players joked about the turbulence until they suddenly realized the plane was flying abnormally close to the mountains. When the pilots eventually saw this too, they immediately began to apply maximum power to gain altitude and climb higher. However, witness accounts and evidence at the scene indicate that the plane crashed into the mountain multiple times. One of the impacts tore off the right wing, which was thrown with such tremendous force that it also ripped off the plane's tail, thereby taking with it the entire rear section of the aircraft, including 2 rows of seats, the galley, and the baggage compartment, while simultaneously leaving a massive hole in the back. The aircraft's momentum and its remaining engine propelled it forward at considerable speed until yet another collision completely severed its left wing. The fuselage then plunged into the snow and careened down the steep glacial slope at a speed of 350 km per hour, much like a high-velocity bobsled, until it violently impacted a snowbank and came to an abrupt halt. The seats tore from the floor and flew forward, crushing the passengers. The impact also shattered the cockpit, pinning both pilots to the panel, instantly killing Ferrades. Of the 45 people, 12 died in the crash, then 5 more succumbed to their wounds the next morning. The co-pilot sustained severe injuries and was trapped in the mangled cockpit. He asked one of the passengers to find his pistol and shoot him, but the passenger refused. The next day, the pilot died. The rugby team's doctor died in the crash, so his duties were taken over by non-professionals, 2 rugby players who were first-year medical students. They set up an improvised infirmary and applied homemade splints and braces to their teammates, fashioned from plane wreckage. Nando Parado had a fractured skull, and he remained unconscious for 3 days. Enrique Platero had a piece of metal lodged in his abdominal cavity, which, when it was eventually removed, took several inches of his intestine with it. Nevertheless, he immediately began helping others. Immediately after receiving initial first aid, the survivors chose a wait-and-see approach. They hid themselves within the fuselage wreckage, constructed a protective wall from suitcases, and placed their trust in the rescuers. What's more, the news they received was good. A radio receiver found in the wreckage was broadcasting a message about the search for the missing aircraft. Representatives from 3 countries participated in the operation: Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. The passengers were absolutely certain they would be found quickly. However, the problem was that no one knew the liner's exact route, as even the pilot himself gave the dispatcher incorrect information during descent, and spotting the crash site from the air was almost impossible. The white plane was unnoticeable against the backdrop of the massive glacier, which after the disaster was named the Glacier of Tears. 4 planes searched for the crash site from dawn until dark, and 11 more the following day. The search area encompassed the crash site, and planes even flew over the survivors 3 times, yet failed to spot them, despite the large cross made of suitcases that the survivors had laid out on the snow. Harsh conditions left rescuers with no hope of finding anyone alive, so rescue efforts were called off after 8 days of searching. They planned to resume the search for victims in December, once the snow had melted. I should add that summer in Chile is during our winter, so nearly 30 people were cut off from the rest of the world without food, water, or warm clothing. Furthermore, at a tremendous height, the oxygen level is lower than usual, and it's very hard to breathe. They were approximately at an altitude of 3,500 meters. At this altitude, there's a risk of developing mountain sickness. It's a negative bodily reaction to height caused by a lack of oxygen. In its mild stage, it's observed in almost everyone who climbs to great heights, and in severe cases, it can lead to death. At sea level, with normal pressure, the oxygen content in the air is almost 21%. This is the norm we are used to. As altitude increases, atmospheric pressure decreases and the air becomes thinner, more rarefied. In practice, this means that with one breath, we get less oxygen than we are used to. The body's first reaction, we breathe more often and deeper. At low altitudes, this works. We stopped, caught our breath. But if you immediately ascend to a high altitude of 3,000 meters, you won't be able to catch your breath, even if you're completely motionless. Hypoxia sets in, a severe lack of oxygen in your blood, brain, and tissues. You slowly begin to die. Fortunately, our body can adapt to oxygen deprivation, but it needs time. This is a small detour about the high altitude where those who survived the plane crash found themselves, and how they were feeling during those initial days. While the rescue efforts were still on the way, the survivors held on to hope that they would be discovered. However, they slowly began to prepare their temporary waiting area, because the challenges they faced were in fact quite numerous. The issue of water was easily resolved. They adapted several metal sheets to melt the snow under the sun. To prevent the danger of snow blindness, they also crafted improvised sunglasses. This is yet another risk that threatens in such a harsh environment. Snow blindness is a traumatic eye condition caused by a reaction to the sun's rays reflected from the snow cover. Interestingly, all the plane's passengers had lived their entire lives by the sea, and some had never even seen snow before the crash. None of them had any experience surviving at high altitudes. Duque este că the temperature at night was reaching 30 degrees below zero. In order to somehow coordinate their work, the captain of the rugby team, Marcelo Perez, took on the role of a leader. Day after day passed, yet no survivors were found, and slowly but surely the question of food began to grow critical. The small provisions they had, which they very carefully rationed among themselves, lasted for only 1 week. There were no plants or animals anywhere that they could possibly eat. When the food ran out, the survivors started to eat the cotton stuffing from the seats and the leather from their belts and shoes. Despite the fact that they perfectly understood this would rather harm them than help, on the 11th day following the catastrophe, they received the dreadful news that the search efforts had been terminated. Any hope of rescue died. It was a terrible blow to the morale of the people. Everyone realized they had only one prospect left: death in the Andes. Days went by and hunger grew more and more intense. The survivors frantically, day after day, repeatedly searched the plane's wreckage and their suitcases, hoping to find at least something. But there was absolutely nothing. They knew the solution to the food problem, but it was too horrible to even think about. The bodies of friends and teammates, preserved outside in the snow, held vital proteins so necessary for the survivors. They agonized for a long time, believing they were going mad, just for thinking such things. Yet it was their only chance for survival, and in the end, hunger won. The group survived by consuming the bodies of their fallen comrades. This decision was not made lightly, as most of the deceased were classmates, close friends or relatives. However, some refused to eat human flesh, or simply couldn't bring themselves to consume the life-saving protein. Initially, it was so repulsive to them that they could only eat skin, muscle and fat. And when all of this was over, they consumed the hearts, the lungs and even the brains. All of the passengers were Roman Catholics. Some were afraid that consuming human flesh would lead to eternal damnation. The last people to begin consuming human flesh were Javier Metol and his wife Liliana Huifeia, who was the only female passenger still alive at that time. Liliana held very strong religious convictions against it and only reluctantly agreed to eat after someone suggested it was like taking Holy Communion, that is the transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Eventually, some of the survivors, citing religious motives, justified their act of cannibalism. However, the group's harrowing ordeal was far from over. 17 days following the initial catastrophe, a massive avalanche descended upon the fuselage as the remaining survivors were asleep. The powerful avalanche almost entirely engulfed the fuselage with snow and ice, tragically suffocating 8 people, causing their deaths, among them Perez, the captain of the rugby team and the acknowledged leader of the survivors. The blizzard raged on relentlessly for 3 days, keeping the remaining survivors trapped alongside the bodies of their deceased within the snow-engulfed fuselage. On the 3rd day, they began to consume the flesh of their recently departed companions. Before the avalanche, a few of the survivors insisted the only way to survive was to trek across the mountains for assistance, because the co-pilot before his death kept mistakenly repeating that the plane had flown over Curico. The survivors believed the nearest Chilean countryside was only a few kilometers to the west. They had no idea they'd crashed deep within the Andes mountain range. The stage, and the Chilean countryside was actually 90 kilometers away from their location. In the first few weeks after the disaster, some survivors embarked on short expeditions to explore the immediate surroundings of the aircraft. But they discovered that altitude sickness, dehydration, snowblindness, malnutrition, and intense nocturnal cold rendered any substantial travel from the crash site impossible. With the warming weather, the survivors finally made the decision to set out on an expedition for help. Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizinten were selected for this mission, being the most resilient. The first attempt at such an expedition proved unsuccessful. However, during it, the trio found the plane's tail section, which was almost undamaged. There were batteries they had hoped to carry to the fuselage and connect to the aircraft's radio system to call for help. However, the batteries proved to be far too heavy. What's more, they didn't realize it, but this entire endeavor was doomed from the very beginning, as the current provided by these batteries would not have been sufficient to power the plane's radio equipment. During this period, 3 more people from the group died from their wounds. On the 60th day, the team learned via a transistor radio that the Uruguayan Air Force had resumed their search. Of course, they were searching not for the living, but for the already deceased. The survivors understood they wouldn't last much longer, so an expedition for help was their only winning option. Parrado, Canessa and Vicentin planned to once again traverse the mountains and seek out help. During their preparations for the expedition, they were given larger portions of meat to build up their strength. They were given the warmest clothing. They were also exempted from performing the daily tasks necessary for the group's survival, so they could fully concentrate on preparing for the upcoming ordeal. Additionally, to combat the night cold, the entire group sewed for them a 3-person sleeping bag from the rear section of the fuselage, electrical wire and the waterproof fabric that had covered the plane's air conditioner. Without any equipment, on December 12, 1972, Parado, Canessa and Vizintin began their ascent of the glacier at an altitude of 3,570 meters, aiming to reach its western ridge, 1,000 meters higher, which blocked their path to the west. Parado was dressed in 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters over a polo shirt and 4 pairs of socks, wrapped in a plastic shopping bag. Their improvised sleeping bag truly kept them alive throughout the cold nights. In one of the documentaries, Canessa described how on their first night it was extremely difficult for them to find a flat spot to set up their sleeping bag. He said it was the worst night of his entire life. On the second day on the mountain, Canessa thought he saw a road leading to the east and he tried to convince Parado to go in that direction. However, Parado disagreed and they were unable to reach an agreement. What's interesting is that only much later Canessa learns that the road he had seen to the east of the crash site would have been easier and would have allowed them to escape more quickly. Eventually, Vizintin was forced to return to conserve food supplies for the remaining 2. Parado and Canessa, despite their illnesses and immense hardships, on the 9th day of their arduous journey, encountered a local shepherd named Sergio Catalan, who subsequently informed the authorities about the group of survivors from the disaster. In 10 days of travel, Parado and Canessa had covered over 60 kilometers in truly life-threatening conditions. By that point, Canessa had lost half of his entire body weight, weighing a mere 44 kilograms. Subsequently, Parado successfully guided the Chilean helicopter to the crash site, using the pilot's map he had carefully brought along. As they flew towards the location, the pilots were truly astonished by the incredibly challenging terrain the 2 men had managed to overcome in order to secure help. 2 helicopters reached the crash site on the afternoon of December 22, 1972. However, due to weather and weight limits, the choppers could only take half the survivors. 4 rescuers volunteered to stay with the others for the last night on the mountain. The second helicopter flight arrived the next morning at dawn. The remaining survivors were rescued almost 2.5 months after the crash. Initially, the survivors told the press that they managed to stay alive by consuming provisions they had brought with them, and after those ran out, they stated they had eaten local vegetation. The true details they initially wanted to discuss with loved ones, but rumors of cannibalism already began to spread. Specifically, in Montevideo, it was said that some survivors killed others for food. On December 23rd, news of cannibalism was published worldwide, except in Uruguay. On December 26th, the front pages of 2 Chilean newspapers displayed 2 photos taken by members of the Andeanid Corps showing a half-eaten human leg. Then, the survivors chose to hold a press conference, intending to share the authentic account of their nearly 3-month-long ordeal. Initially, these survivors encountered significant public disapproval, but once they disclosed the solemn pact they had made amongst themselves to offer their bodies should they perish to aid the survival of others, the widespread indignation gradually diminished. A Catholic priest listened to the confessions of those who survived, and he assured them that they would not be condemned for cannibalism considering the extreme nature of the situation in which they had survived. The Argentine authorities and the families of the deceased decided to inter the remains of the victims at the crash site within a common grave. Relatives were not permitted to be present at the burial. However, Ricardo Echevare, the father of one of the victims, received a message from one of the survivors that his son wanted to be buried at home. Unable to obtain official permission from the Argentine authorities to search for his son's body, Ricardo hired guides and organized his own illegal expedition. He made arrangements with the priest who had buried his son in a mass grave on the mountain, asking him to mark the bag containing his son's body. However, Ricardo was subsequently arrested for grave robbery. Nevertheless, a federal judge and the local mayor intervened to secure his release, and Ricardo was later permitted to organize a proper funeral for his son. The fates of those who survived varied greatly thereafter, but they consistently maintained close contact with one another. Soon after his rescue, Nando Parado authored a book, a detailed reconstruction of his memories from Flight 571, which quickly became a bestseller. Later, 2 decades on, he served as a consultant for the film Alive, which was based on his book and in which his character was portrayed by actor Ethan Hawke. He also became a successful businessman, developed a passion for racing and sports, got married, and now has 2 daughters. He also founded 2 television and 1 cable media company. Roberto Canessa, after these events, also married soon after and now has 3 children. He quit rugby and became a cardiologist and a speaker. In 1994, Roberto was even a candidate in the presidential elections of Uruguay, but he did not receive sufficient public support. Many of the catastrophe's survivors also engaged in community work, supporting their fellow citizens in difficult situations. For example, they actively promoted organ donation in Uruguay, stating that the country's citizens should make a pact with life, the same one they made in 1972. Also, in 2010, the survivors supported 33 Chilean miners who were trapped underground due to an accident. Based on these events, the film 33 was made, starring Antonio Banderas. But that's another story. If you found my story today interesting, I'd like to remind you that you can support my channel by subscribing to it so you don't miss any future episodes, and also by leaving a like and a comment. And with that, I'll be saying goodbye to you until next Sunday. So, until we meet again on the vast expanses of YouTube.